Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Professor Joseph Henrich. Professor Henrich is a professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University. He has written many books on human evolution, and today we will speak about his latest book, The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. Professor Henrich, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's great to be with you.
So I'm always curious about the background of the author. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. How is it that you became interested in evolution, and how is it that you became interested in writing? And you have written all these books, maybe the titles of your previous books as well?
I started off, so when I was an undergraduate, I was studying, I had both a BS in aerospace engineering and a BA in anthropology. And I was trying to decide what to do. And so I worked as an engineer for a few years. And during that period, I did a lot of reading. And I got increasingly interested in cultural anthropology and also evolution. So I was studying evolution at the same time and ended up going to UCLA to get my PhD in cultural anthropology. But then during that period, I got very dissatisfied with the theory that was available in cultural anthropology. So I began integrating ideas from psychology and economics, behavioral economics especially, and also working with a guy named Rob Boyd on ideas about how we could build mathematical models to think about cultural evolution more systematically. And mostly what I was thinking about was how to develop an empirical program, so how to collect data to test these ideas about cultural evolution. And so we just went from there and increasingly got interested in how genes had shaped our genetic evolution over long stretches of human history. So that's what my 2015 book is about, The Secret of Our Success. And that's about how much of human evolution, our genetic evolution, has been driven by cultural evolution.
And what was it that made you dissatisfied with the way that cultural evolution was being taught, or you were studying it?
Yeah, so within cultural anthropology, there wasn't much that looked to me as someone with an engineering background as scientific theory. So, there was a general sort of inclination that culture was important, but people didn't seem to me to be measuring culture in systematic ways, measuring people's psychology in systematic ways, or thinking about, in mathematical terms, about how this might change over time or shape human genetic evolution.
So in essence, it was mostly a science of anecdotes, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of storytelling, which I think is a powerful way of communicating information. And I'm also a great fan of ethnography. So I took from cultural anthropology the importance of deep ethnography, of getting to know a place, of studying a community, studying people over their entire life course, children and adults. But to that, I wanted to add the full repertoire of, say, psychological tools from psychology, the ways that behavioral economics do things. And I really like the way that economists handle statistics.
Okay, and then what is it that drove you towards this book, The Weirdest People in the World? What was the trigger point?
Yeah, so when I moved to the University of British Columbia in 2005, I encountered two social psychologists, Steve Heine and Oren Zion. And they were doing cultural psychology, so comparing different populations, mostly East Asians, Japanese. Steve studies Japanese, and Ara had been worked in a number of populations with European descent Canadians and European descent Americans. And they were finding some interesting cultural differences. And when we sat together at lunch and we talked about our areas of different expertise, what we found was not only were the populations we were comparing were the usual populations studied by psychologists, one among many, but they were particularly unusual when looked at in a global perspective. So anytime you had 3 or 4 populations, the European descent populations from Canada, for example, were unusual in comparison to the other populations. So this led us to conduct a review of all the available data, of which it was relatively limited. So it turns out that over 90% of studies done by experimentalists, whether it's economists or psychologists at the time, were done among university students or other populations from Canada, the US, Australia, places like that.
Okay, and then how is it, you have a global perspective, how is it that no, first of all, can you define weird? What is weird versus common?
Yeah, so we coined this acronym WEIRD, stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And we meant it as a consciousness raising device because we wanted to tell researchers that the populations that they were relying on for their entire textbooks essentially were unusual when looked at in a global perspective. And if you grow up in these societies, you tend to think that's the usual way humans are. So we like the term weird because it captured this notion that you should really step back and take a global and historical perspective at this.
And being that most of the world have been colonized by the Europeans, either one or the other one, aren't we the common people and the rest of the world the weird ones?
Well, as a when you kind of in writing the book, I was able to generate a lot of maps and variation, and despite the effects of colonization and the European expansion, it's still the case that we see lots of global psychological variation. With on many of the dimensions, the populations where weird culture has become common, you can see the psychological variation even today.
Okay, and can you tell us from a historical perspective, because at one time we were all one happy tribe, similar to each other. So evolutionary, how is it that we became weird? What were the things that make us different from the rest of the world?
Yeah, so I mean, the case that I make is that a key element and that affects how people think and structures the environment you grow up in, which affects your emotions and the heuristics you use to solve problems, is the family. So if we look around the world, we can have measures from anthropology of different family structures, and we can see that many aspects of human psychology, including individualism and overconfidence, analytic thinking, the role of intentions and moral judgments, and lots of other dimensions seem to be associated with different kinds of family structures. So then the question was, well, when and where did European families transform from the kind of intensive, clan-based, networked forms of kinship that we find around the world and found in pre-Christian Europe into the monogamous nuclear families that characterize lots of these descent societies today and lots of people in the modern world. So, interestingly, the first thing which is widely agreed upon is that these families were common, at least in parts of Europe, prior to the big economic expansion. So by 1500, the end of the Middle Ages, European populations in places like France and England were already dominated by a monogamous nuclear family ideal. And so the case I make in the book is that this began when one branch of Christianity, the one that evolved into the Roman Catholic Church, began to lay down a series of prohibitions and prescriptions about marriage and the family that ended cousin marriage and polygyny, enforced bilateral inheritance, and eventually, over centuries, broke European families down into monogamous nuclear families.
Okay, you have okay, so when the Europeans started colonizing the world, there was England who colonized a huge part of the globe, and then there were the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and blah, blah, blah. It so happens that the countries colonized by the English somehow nowadays seems to be richer economically than the countries colonized. For example, I'm from Colombia, South America, but all that area was colonized by the Spaniards, the Portuguese as well. And somehow, yeah, and I see Australia, for example, New Zealand, United States, Canada, all these countries are richer than the ones colonized by the Spaniards. Do you have any theory on why that happened like that?
Well, I mean, when we run our statistical analyses using these family structures, lots of populations in the places conquered by the Spaniards had some of the most sophisticated societies that could be found in the New World. Groups like the Aztecs and the Maya and the Inca Empire had lots of complex societies. And many of those populations, despite the devastation and genocide wrought by the Spaniards, still survive into this day. Think of the Quechua-speaking populations in Peru. So when you take account of their family structure, the psychological variation we find across these populations is consistent with what we'd expect. Whereas in North America, the level of destruction, the amount of deaths and the kind of almost complete replacement almost, of course. I mean, there's still Aboriginal American populations persist, but compared to when the English arrived in North America, they've taken most of the land and dominate. So it's just the family structure is consistent with the kinds of psychological patterns that we would expect based on that kinship structure. And then the argument is that those ways of thinking fit well with the kind of institutions of impersonal governments and democracy and those kinds of institutions. So, and that leads to things like innovation. So, the end of the book, I discuss the things that generate innovation and the importance of openness to immigrants, lots of building ties with strangers, weak family ties, those kinds of things.
Okay, so we also tend, as weird people that we tend to be, of course, more individualistic, and that also brings that we are more lonely or lonelier. We suffer from imposter syndrome. We have suffered from self-worth. I wonder if you have any opinion on, and while societies that tend to have this clan mentality, somehow they, from my perspective, seem to be happier because they are always, I don't know, with their loved one. They form part of this group bigger than themselves. I wonder how far off am I?
Yeah, no, and that's consistent with the ideas that I develop in the book. Is that if you look at measures of happiness, some of the happiest people in the world seem to be people are happier when they have material security. So that's kind of an easy one. So societies that are more material secure tend to be happier. But within those societies, people with strong family ties are also happier. So there's something about being enveloped in a tight kinship network with lots of people you can rely on. Your family gives you a sense of identity. It connects you to the past. So these things all give people a sense of meaning, that when you're just an individual set adrift in a large society of anonymous strangers, that's when you get kind of loneliness and unhappiness, a sense of dislocation, questions about your identity and purpose in the world, and those kinds of things. And you see that one of the things I discussed, and this is relevant to your previous question, was the spread of Protestantism. So Protestantism, even more than the Catholicism that's so common in Latin America, it doesn't ensconce them in a church. It doesn't provide a priesthood. It doesn't provide this big institution to kind of scaffold your life with these rituals and stuff. In many forms of Protestantism, it's maybe you and your small congregation, but you're really alone in the sight of God. And you see things like suicide rates increase among Protestants. And the argument goes all the way back to people like Weber and Durkheim, that there's this sense of loneliness that comes with Protestantism, because it's just you and the big God.
Right, suicide rates among Protestant or also among the richer societies have the highest rate of suicide as opposed to, I don't know, poor Indian tribe that have this sense of community, and to think of suicide is just weird.
Exactly. But then the other place where suicide can really crop up is when people get stuck in the intermediate stage. So, you have one set of demands that's saying, you want to be part of this network and community, and you have all these obligations that give you that nice warm feeling of interpersonal relationships independence. But you might have other demands from the secular institutions, secular laws, things like that, pulling you in another direction. So I do spend a lot of time talking about the kind of discontent that you can get with globalization, because you have these two ways of thinking pulling you in different directions.
I wonder also how our brains have evolved since we became industrialized society.
Yeah, so in the book, I'm pretty clear about distinguishing genetic from cultural evolution. And the argument is that our brains respond ontogenetically, so not genetically, but through development and childhood experience. And so one of the kind of things that people don't always understand, and that you really need to look at the neuroscience for, is that our brains are very plastic. So growing up with different institutions, speaking different languages, using different technologies, leads people to have different brains, even if they're twins, right? Even if they're genetically identical. So it's the case that you do get different brains as people adapt to different institutional environments. One of the examples I start off with is reading. So if you're in a culture where everybody learns to read as a child, you get a thicker corpus callosum and specialized circuitry in your left ventral hemisphere that you don't see in illiterate people. So that's an institution and set of values that leads children to learn to read, that leads to differences in their brains. And that has all kinds of downstream implications. So one idea that neuroscientists have suggested is that when you learn to read, you actually get worse at recognizing faces because it might impinge on some of your facial recognition machinery in your brain. So there are costs to these kinds of things as well. But yeah, so I go through the possibility that there could have been genetic evolution as a consequence of this. And I think just the studies of immigrants and other populations suggest that there's no reason to suspect that that has had an important impact. And if anything, I make the case that it would have gone the other way. And the reason why it might have gone the other way in European history is because a lot of the action in my story happens in these urbanizing towns that can be found throughout Europe. And until the 19th century, really around 1900, so the beginning of the 20th century, most towns and cities were death traps. So if you had genes that led you to have a certain psychology that would have attracted you to individualism or trust in strangers or focusing on intentions, you would have moved to the town and then you would have died of some disease or plague or something like that. So if anything, genetic evolution would have been pushing in the opposite direction than some people's intuition suggests. But more importantly, I think the study of immigrants shows that anybody can acquire these cultural practices or lose them. And so it's just a matter of enculturation.
Right. Okay. So you speak a lot about individualism, but in fact, we tend to seek people or groups or organizations that are like us. One example is educated people seek the company of other educated people. Rich people seek the company of other rich people. And since we tend to cluster this way, isn't this maybe a recipe for more social inequality? The fact that rich educated people get together and that left out the non-rich, non-educated people?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends what's driving that. So, if it's driving that are things like social barriers and discrimination and oppression, then you can just remove those barriers and get it down. We could imagine a world where those things have been minimized, and then what we just have are people selecting based on their particular genotypes. And that doesn't actually change the mean, but it does increase the variance. So, for example, if there are genes that affect autism, and people who are a little bit higher on the autism spectrum tend to go into engineering or computer science or something like that where they don't have to interact with other people, and then they tend to marry each other and mate, then that's going to lead to greater variance. So you're going to get people who are higher on the autism spectrum and people who are lower on the autism spectrum. There are interesting ways in which cultural institutions can affect the distribution of genes, was the point of that example.
Okay, and how about war? I mean, we also are warriors who are constantly going to war against one another. I wonder also what's the impact of war and battling with different societies. How does that make us weird or less weird?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of intergroup conflict is pretty old, and I talk about this in The Secret of Our Success. I think that intergroup conflict has shaped human societies in lots of interesting ways. I make the case that there was intensive warfare going on in Europe, lots of conflicts, and you can actually see the effects on European towns. And I've studied this with others, and war shocks seem to make people more interdependent, and it makes them have greater solidarity, but with a tighter in-group, and it also causes stronger norm adherence. So that could be norm adherence, meaning deference to elders and tighter clan loyalties. Say if your norm is for arranged marriage, you might endorse arranged marriage more strongly. But if you have a different set of norms that says you should be fair to strangers, and you should, marry based on love and not take other factors into account, those things can be also strengthened by these war shocks. So I make the case that in these emerging European towns, wars may have actually increased the strength of norms for egalitarian interactions, fairness with strangers, and whatnot. And that may have fostered economic growth. Because the puzzling thing that this research done by some economists shows is that war shocks, rather than making towns less successful, actually leads to more economic growth in the years after the war. which is a bit non-intuitive, but if it causes people to bind together and causes greater solidarity, then that's less puzzling.
Wow. I imagine a certain scenario, and I wonder, since you study evolution, if you may have a theory. Imagine for a second that the Europeans discovered America and decided not to invade it, not to colonize it, but to leave it and see what happened. So in a scenario like that, how would America be different from the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a tough one and not one that I've thought much about. I mean, if you go back to Jared Diamond's argument, Diamond in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel argues that in terms of the increasing size of societies, that the Middle East essentially got a head start. Eurasia gets a head start on the rest of the world because there's a particular distribution of plants and animals, and the geography is just more suitable for more rapid and early agriculture. And then once you have agriculture, just, you got to figure out how to scale up your institutions and generate more cooperation. And it is interesting to note that, when the Spaniards, so the East, the Americas are separated from Eurasia for, their last common ancestor are some hunter-gatherers. Right? I mean, there was a little bit now, we know from the genetics of contact with Polynesia in Peru, or probably in South America somewhere. But aside from that, rather limited contact, mostly separated. But when the Spaniards arrive, so Cortez arrives and he goes into Mexico City essentially, it's very comprehensible to them. There's a hereditary leader, there's a bureaucracy. The Aztec was an expansionist empire. They conquered and subjugated various peoples. That was just about what Cortez had in mind. So it didn't look that different than what he'd seen. Of course, there were lots of interesting, you could tell a story about interesting differences, and I do point out some of those. But there was also an interesting parallel development in the way these two different parts of the world had developed since they were commonly hunter-gatherers.
Well, it does make us wonder about how we continue evolving, and maybe what kind of a species will be 100 or 500 years from now. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you?
Yeah, so it's the weirdest people in the world, and I also have the kind of prequel to that book is called The Secret of Our Success, and those two kind of form a package. And, you can follow me at J-O Henrich on Twitter. Or if you Google me, I'm first up. So Joseph Henrich.
Well, Professor Henrich, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, great to be with you.